Thank you all so much for joining us for today's presentation. My name is Jen Hanft, and I'm part of the State Library of North Carolina's Government and Heritage Library. The State Library is happy to host today's program in celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month. We encourage you to visit jewishheritagemonth.gov to find out more about Jewish American Heritage Month after today's program. Please also visit the State Library of North Carolina's website to learn more about the Government and Heritage Library's collections and services. We're delighted to be joined today by author Kimberly Hartnett. Kimberly Marlowe Hartnett spent much of her childhood in newsrooms, tagging along after her parents to work at community newspapers and TV stations. She worked for many years as a print journalist in New England and the Pacific Northwest, including the better part of a decade as a writer and editor for the Seattle Times. She is, as you know, the author of a biography on Harry Golden titled Carolina Israelite: How Harry Golden Made Us Care About Jews, the South, and Civil Rights, published by the University of North Carolina Press. She now lives in New Hampshire and works as an editor and a teacher of writing. She's a graduate of Smith College in Massachusetts and is pursuing a master's degree through Johns Hopkins University. She can be contacted through her website, which is kimberlymhartnett.com or wellworthreading.com. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Kimberly Hartnett. Kimberly, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Jen. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good. I have to say, given the terrible news out of Texas yesterday and this morning, there are few places I'd rather be than looking at all of you, friends and fellow writers and teachers, and more than a few past employers, as it turns out. So thank you for coming today. This is a tragic and sad day in our country. So I think it feels fitting to me to be talking about a man who showed many of us that it's possible to make change as an individual, change for the better. I also have to say, I'm so grateful to the State Library of North Carolina, which with their immense resources and support of writers and teachers and other folks around the country in North Carolina, they've been so helpful. And I also feel like I need to send up a cheer. I would do a wave if I was not the only person sitting here, for the Atkins Library, University of North Carolina, Charlotte. That is where the majority of Harry Golden's papers are archived in their great special collections. And they, along with the public library in Charlotte, the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, really made it possible for me to do this book and have continued to support my yakking about it all these years. So any chance I get to say, yay, libraries, yay, North Carolina, I'm doing it. And the University of North Carolina Press, of course, published this book and continues to support it in a way I find absolutely astonishing and gratifying. So again, yay, North Carolina. Some of you in this vast group, I'm amazed how many people are here, particularly those of you who are my age and older, you know something about Harry Golden. Some of you, you may have grown up seeing his books in your parents' or grandparents' houses. I certainly grew up reading his books. They were all over my house when I was a kid. And in the early 50s and 60s, I'm told from reliable sources, you really couldn't ride the New York subway without seeing somebody with their nose in one of his books. He was what we would call an influencer today, which is a term that he would make fun of if he were here. He really was everywhere. He was a pop culture icon in his time, another term he would make fun of. I think it's important to make clear he was a humorist. He's always sort of categorized as that, but not in the sense exactly of a stand-up comedian. It was really his ability to talk about very tough things with an eye to absurdity and human foible and comic moments that made him a humorist. And Harry wrote into the 1970s, but also important to remember his real heyday was the 50s through the 60s, I would say. Now, his fame really started with his oddball little newspaper, the Carolina Israelite, which, as I love to say, is a name that no branding expert would go along with today, but that's what he called it. And he published that from 1944 to 1968. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. He also wrote more than 20 books, actually 21, but one of them wasn't published, which is just as well, having read it. 5 of his books made the New York Times bestseller list, beginning with his first collection of essays. He called them editorials. I call them essays. That came out in 58, and that was only in America, which was an expression that he used a lot in writing and speaking. It's probably the best known of his books. Now, the stuff in those books, for the most part, were collections of short essays. They started out life in his paper, in the Carolina Israelite. Then he would reprint them in books. He would often expand them for articles and other publications, and he would draw on them in speeches he made around the country. Those were essentially the same as what we call a blog post today. They're about the same length, covered a very big range of subjects, as blog posts often do: nostalgic childhood memories, history, thoughts on books and movies, celebrity and political scandals of the day. It has to be noted that some of them seem dated today, the language and the style. Golden was definitely sexist, but many of his essays do stand the test of time. And I think all of them are a fascinating look back at what regular people were reading and what they liked in popular media of the day. It's hard to draw a straight line from Golden to right to today's commentators, but I think his legacy of mixing history and current events and strong opinions and satire definitely fed that practice, that kind of entertainment in America. He wasn't the first person to do this or the only person in his time, but he was certainly one of the most popular. And he inspired this kind of commentary, and in my opinion, still does. Now, many of us, myself included, with some reluctance, but it's a reality, get a lot of our news today in the form of commentary rather than straight news. I can see the journalists in the group, putting their heads down sadly, but yeah, that's a reality. We get a lot of our news from late night hosts, from columnists, blogs, podcasts, from personalities rather than only from journalists. And that really was a tradition that Golden kind of got rolling, I think. And he did something that was rarely done well for a popular audience at the time. He used humor to bring attention to some very painful, sad, frightening things, prejudice, racism, poverty, government corruption. And by bringing humor to it, I don't mean that he made light of it, but he did find ways to, satirize it is probably the best word I can come up with, to point out the ridiculous nature, particularly of racial prejudice. He was definitely a showman, especially on camera or doing public speaking. He was not always willing to let the facts get in the way of a good story. In my opinion, he was accurate for the most part when it counted. He certainly was a sophisticated thinker in some ways. And he was a gifted natural teacher, which is something I've really come to appreciate as I've tried to learn to be a teacher myself. He made a lot of people, including me growing up, and really still when I revisit his work, go back and read history of the past, look up things that he was talking about. He he had a way of motivating people to learn more about topics. And I think that's the greatest gift a writer can have, regardless of what their genre is. If they make you want to go read more about something in our time and in our past, they've succeeded. Now, once the Carolina Israelite caught on a little bit, which started to happen really in the early 50s, he was on the radio quite suddenly, late night TV, in the big magazines of the day, including Life magazine. He had a syndicated newspaper column eventually. He was often quoted at length in the Congressional Record. And he was at least once, I've looked for other times, but at least once he was a clue in the New York Times crossword puzzle, which I think ensures that he absolutely was famous if you had any doubt. There you go. In his time, he was a person who showed a lot of us, multiple generations, that we had common ground with others of different backgrounds, different races, genders, you name it. And he found ways to remind us of that whether we're white, black, Jew, Gentile, regardless of the era in which we were born, that most of us get up every day and try to do better and make a better life for our families. At the time that he was saying these things in an extremely segregated society, this came across sometimes as a fairly radical notion. Bigotry and racism depended then and now on marginalizing and profiling groups and making them the other. And Golden was very good at pointing out when that was being done, whether it was anti-Semitism or racism or any of the other isms. He had a gift for pointing that out. When I read his work today, especially today, literally, I wish he could still be around and writing, because promoting that notion that we Americans really, I still believe, have more in common than not, and that we need to pull together really in order to live together. We could certainly use that as we, face these huge needs to reduce the violence and bigotry in our country. Now, a big part of his appeal was the simplicity of most of his writing. Again, here's the kind of bloggish nature of what he did. His critics often dismissed him for that, and some historians still do. But even they often recognized his skill in using kind of simple and anecdotal writing to make a point that a lot of people would not have tolerated or understood otherwise. Dr. King, in his famous letter from Birmingham jail in '63, singled Golden out along with just a couple of other people. And he said Golden was one of the few white writers who wrote about civil rights, and it's the struggle for civil rights in this country, in, quote, eloquent and prophetic, unquote, ways. And I think that says it just about as well as anyone could. So let me tell you just a little bit about his roots and his rich life that sort of led to him being the success that he was. And I just realized I can't read my stopwatch here, so I'm going to turn my phone back on. All right, well, someone's going to have to wave frantically. So Golden and his family came from what's now Ukraine, which is another reason I wish he was around writing today, because he'd have plenty to say. And they came in shifts, as immigrant families, still do when they have the money and the opportunity. They came in the first few years of the 20th century, settled on the Lower East Side in a block that was almost entirely Jewish families. He had a different name then. He was Chaim Goldhirsch in those days, and he had several name changes over the course of his life, all of which he instigated himself. He liked to say it was changed at Ellis Island, and that was actually not true. He did it himself later, but it was a better story to say Ellis Island. He was a bookworm. He was that kid who noticed things, especially the contradictory, funny, heartbreaking details of people's lives. He had that ability from a very young age, from what I can gather. And he wrote about things, small slice of life things, all of his writing life. He wrote about settlement houses on the Lower East Side, the sort of early social programs for immigrants. He wrote about families like his own that were jammed into these teeny little tenements. He wrote about mothers like his own mother who insisted, even though she spoke no English or very little English and couldn't write it or read it, she made sure her kids had library cards as soon as they could walk down to the library on their own. He used to say he never closed a book for any woman except his mother. I told you he was sexist, and that's probably the cleanest reference of that I could come up with. But he had a way of making jokes out of these tough circumstances that I was just mentioning. I'll read you a bit that demonstrates that, and demonstrates a couple of things. So in an essay he wrote, and he did versions of this more than once, he wrote about the tiny apartment that he lived in with his parents and 5 siblings, I think. And this would have been in about 1909 on the Lower East Side. So after he's talking about how small the place is, he gets onto the lavatory arrangements for the family. And he says a bathroom down the hall served 5 families. Originally, the toilets were in the yard in back of the tenement, an urban outhouse divided into about 4 or 5 separate booths with a latch on the inside of each door. The board that served as a toilet cover was of one piece. And so when one fellow lifted it up in his booth, it caused quite a disturbance in the other enclosures, which led to constant communication among the occupants. Once a month, a crew came to clean the ditches under the outhouse. They were usually Polish workmen, and I have never forgotten how those men remained standing in the ditch in their hip boots, eating their lunch. Now, I read that more than 50 years ago, and I've always remembered it. And I'm sure if Harry Golden had held forth about, the terrible conditions of tenements in the kind of language that most people use when they're writing about that, I would not have remembered it. But he had this ability to use humor and small detail. So you really could imagine the workmen, leaning on their shovels, eating their lunch out in back of the outhouse. That's what he did. It was unusual at the time, and it caught people's attention and told them something they wouldn't have otherwise known. He was also always a political animal, what we would call today a political junkie, and very articulate about it. He could call a race within a few points. He had a real gift for understanding politics. He wrote often about Tammany Hall. And I know a couple of people here who are friends and colleagues of mine from outside the country who might not have heard of that. The shortest way to describe it is the Democratic Party's political machine that pretty much ran New York City Democratic, therefore politics, in a big way from 1790s, really through the 30s and technically through the 60s, I suppose, or into the 60s. Didn't have much power at the end of the reign there, but for all those years, that's if you wanted a city job or you wanted a turkey at Christmas, Tammany Hall was your provider. So this is what Harry wrote about Tammany Hall of his childhood. The Tammany boss, Big Tim Sullivan, had about 50 student barbers working for him on every election day. Here's how it worked. Along about August, Big Tim sent word around the Bowery flop houses for the bums to let their beards grow. By election day, Big Tim had at his disposal several hundred Bowery men, each with a full-grown beard. First, each man would vote with a full beard under one name. Then he would rush to one of the standby barbers who immediately clipped off the beard. So then the man voted under a second name with sideburns. Then he would rush back to the barber who shaved off the sideburns, and now the man would vote for the third time with just a mustache. Finally, that came off, and he would go forth to vote a fourth time, plain-faced, as Tammany called it. For this day's work, the man got $1, 3 meals, a pint of whiskey, and of course, a lesson in civics and good government. I just love that story. So by the 1920s, Bookworm Harry has found himself on Wall Street with a lot of other people, making a lot of money very fast. He was really good salesman. He could sell anything to anybody. There were a lot of people doing this and a lot of people breaking law and ethics. Harry got caught and got a prison sentence for fraud. So off he went, and then it was possible to hide a prison sentence in a way that it wouldn't be today. But when he got out, he did just that. He changed his name at that point to Harry Golden. And he left New York City, left his wife and 3, soon to be 4 sons there, and moved south where he thought he could make a living. He was having trouble in the Depression years, of course, finding work in New York City in the best of circumstances. He actually ended up in Charlotte about 1940. He had contacts there at small labor movement newspapers, and he worked as an ad salesman. He would claim for the rest of his life that he went south intentionally to cover the civil rights movement. That is not true. It was more luck than planning. But he knew what version of the story was going to play better, so he stuck to that one. And so by 44, he's got enough presence, he's in Charlotte. He's got enough presence in Charlotte to start the Carolina Israelite. Now, it began as a interfaith newspaper, and it was backed by leading Jewish businessmen of the time who really wanted an interfaith newspaper and wanted only that. And that's all it was for a couple of months. And pretty quickly, Harry found his own voice, and he got tired of running, columns from Southern rabbis and news of interfaith picnics and so forth. And he starts sneaking in, these nostalgic pieces about the Lower East Side, in this, like the Tammany piece, and people really like it. And his backers, in various ways, began to step away from him because they sort of saw where this was going and that they were not necessarily going to want to be associated with it. And sure enough, within the first couple of years, Harry is on to what people at the time called the race question. So he's writing about subjects that are very far from what his original backers had anticipated he would write about. We've gone from interfaith picnics to, why are we in a segregated state, in a segregated region, in a segregated country? The issue, of course, was heating up, particularly after the war years. And Harry was fascinated by the battle and the conversation about moving away from segregation. He saw very clearly early on, I've always been fascinated by this, how that institutionalized racism had created huge inequities in not just education and in economic ways, but also very much in healthcare. The quality of healthcare differed so greatly. It still does to some extent, of course, in our country, but at this point, it was so dramatic. And he felt that enabled and protected racial violence, that kind of inequity. And he was right. So a lot of his early writing about it, or really all of his writing about it, some of it, it's short, it's not terribly deep, but he did some unusually good and I think extremely brave writing, particularly on healthcare and education system failings that were linked to racism, and about what we would call today hate crimes. He wrote a lot about the history of lynching in our country. that was one of those areas that I went on to read quite a bit about. Sorry about the fire truck that just went by. There's been about 4 of them. I hope it's not our house. He really motivated me to read widely on the subject of lynching because he was so articulate about that history. So he first gets on the national map with his race stuff. He's already got a following for the nostalgic Lower East Side material, and but he's getting attention on the racial questions, and he started coming out with these things called golden plans. And those of you who do know something about him know about these. His first one he put out in 1956. This is when some lawmakers and voters in North Carolina are working pretty hard to find ways to legally keep schools segregated. Because at this time, of course, the pressure's been on for a couple of years not to do that anymore. So Golden comes up with this plan that he says with, a perfectly straight face when he's doing speeches and very straightforward when he's writing it, that plays off of something that was a common practice at the time, which sounds absurd and is absurd when I say it today. It was okay to stand in line with mixed race in that era. If you were at the bank or the post office, everybody could stand in the same line. But the minute people started sitting down, then it had to be segregated, classrooms, buses, movie theaters. And so Golden's solution, which he put forward with great sort of wordy legislative packaging around it, was let's just take all the chairs out of school. If everybody's standing up all the time, then we don't have a problem. And as you would imagine, late night TV of the day and radio of the day, they loved this. I mean, there's nothing like a soundbite to make everybody discover you as a writer. I'm still trying to come up with a soundbite, so I will be discovered as a writer. But this is what really put Harry out in the, just in the world, not just the country. This is another way, of course, that he really resembles today's influencers. If you look at the people who get sort of press and who are at the top of your news feed, whatever that might be, if you have one, it's people who can really boil something down, especially if it's an absurd thing, right down to its essence. And he could do that. He certainly wasn't anyone's idea of an icon in a lot of ways, then or now. My favorite thing about him of all is that he was 56 when his first book came out, which I think I was about 56 when my book on him came out. So he was, short, stout, never without a cigar, hardly ever without a glass of bourbon. He had this sort of gravelly voice. He had a lot of flaws. He was quite the womanizer, which every man I interviewed who knew him just shook his head and could not figure out how that was possible, but it was. Huge self-promoter. He took to fame, though, with a visible kind of joy that's really pretty great to see, even if you're aware that he's kind of an operator. He spoke to groups. He did more speeches than probably any politician of his era. And he often spoke on behalf of politicians Democrats running for office on the state and national level. He was very good at it. He would step in for them if they couldn't make it. But he spoke to groups in every major city. He raised a lot of money for the NAACP, for the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, other national groups. He was a master networker. I keep using terms he would never have used. That's another one. He had a real gift for friendship, though, some of them quite genuine, some of them very opportunistic. He was very close to Carl Sandburg, the poet and biographer of Lincoln. The most interesting correspondence in some ways that I read of his, and there's a lot of it, was early correspondence with Robert Kennedy and his correspondence with Billy Graham, of all people, another North Carolinian, and a true bond between them, and just this incredibly rich series of letters between them. But even as he, I think, enjoyed being a gadfly, and that's like the perfect word for him, his greatest strength in some ways was in terms of his influence, was he grasped something early on that very few white or journalists or historians figured out. They came to it later. Was the vital role of the African American church in the civil rights movement. And he wrote about that really early on. He saw early on that the nonviolent platform of the early church leaders, such as Dr. King, would be hugely important, would get the attention of America in a way that nothing else had, that it would be followed by more militant activists who would in turn change the shape of the movement, and indeed America in the process. And he wrote about this with great effectiveness. Now, as respected and respectful of the early Black leaders in the movement, as he was often at odds with leaders of the Jewish community, nationally, even as he raised money for them, and locally. He would say things that embarrassed them. He would call attention to himself and make generalizations about Jews and non-Jews in ways that they just found mortifying. He was very tough on the Jewish community, however he defined that in the moment, about if he felt they were being too moderate or not speaking up enough around racial issues. Many of you know, probably most of you know, that American Jews played a crucial role in the civil rights movement. Usually what gets written about is our participation in voter registration in the South, freedom riders. There were lots of other entry points. And Golden made sure that the country knew about that kind of activity and that kind of participation, but he really made sure if he felt that members of the Jewish community were not doing all they could. So, he did often embarrass people by name. Just looking at the time here. The older he got, the more pointed he was about anti-Semitism too. I think as the movement started to become more militant, and there was less of a need for him to be on stage educating people about what we needed in the form of civil rights. And as he aged, he talked more about the anti-Semitism that had been part and was still part of American culture. Some of you may remember or have read about in 65, I think it was, Pope Paul VI put out this really important declaration, I think it's called, where he basically said, okay, we're gonna stop saying that Christ killer stuff. Okay, this is, we can't say that anymore. We're taking that out of the prayers. We're not going to talk about that anymore. We know you didn't kill Jesus. Now, this was a centuries old weapon, really. And this was a big deal for Christian-Jewish relations. And every Christian leader you could think of, came forward and said how great it was, that the Pope had done this. And most Jewish leaders, everybody was on board with this was great. Well, except for Harry, who saw an opportunity to be poke the bear, if I'm not being disrespectful to the Pope by saying that. And he put out one of his essays in the paper, and he said, yeah, that's great that we're not saying that anymore, but let's also have our own ecumenical council as Jews, and then, quote, forgive the Christians for the Inquisition, the Crusades, the ghettos, and the expulsions. So, of course, Jewish leaders are just absolutely horrified by this. Here's this big, centuries overdue step, and the Pope does it, and it's a feel-good moment, and Harry is just poking him with this, right? After many of them, and this happened several times in Harry's career, wrote to leading magazines of the day who had covered this saying, he doesn't speak for me, right? So Harry responded to that by reprinting his essay and sending it out as his holiday card at the end of that holiday season, the end of the year. So I have some of those holiday cards. His late son had a whole pile of them, and right before he died, he sent them to me and he said, send one of these out every year. He had a voice like Harry's. That was Richard. So, Golden was a grandstander. And like most humorists who get a lot of mileage out of religious and class differences, he generalized in ways that are unfair, but they're guaranteed to amuse and they're guaranteed to make you think. I think it's interesting to me in the years that when I first started interviewing people for this book, which was so long ago that many of the people had known Harry personally, a lot of them were still upset over that kind of behavior. But if I talked to them long enough and let them hold forth long enough, they would almost all come around at the end to saying, he did a lot of good. He was brave to stand up the way he did. Yeah, he was annoying, and he was a self-promoter, but he stood up to the Klan, to the haters, and he did it as one person. He wasn't part of a big news organization with a lot of protection. It was just him. Now, as I say throughout the book, and whenever I talk about him, I sort of end up hammering this point. He had a lot of flaws. He was, by today's standards, certainly probably an alcoholic. He was terrible with money. He was a womanizer. He was a con man. He was a felon. But he was also very smart, very kind-hearted, an original thinker. And most important to me, and I hope to people who know of his work as well, he was courageous on behalf of people who needed a champion. And I think his flaws have always given me hope. Was thinking about it this morning in light of the Texas stories. One person really can make a difference. No matter how flawed we are, there's something we can do. And I think, particularly as a writer or a teacher or a parent, there's things you can say and do that do bring about change. And he reminds me of that every time I reread his material. I usually like to close these talks with a couple of short lines from him. And I'm at that point. One of my favorite stories about him is whenever he spoke, often on college campuses, but lots of other places, and they do the question part at the end, which was his favorite part, like it's my favorite part. Somebody would always say, what can I, as a single person, just one lone person, do, to make a difference in civil rights? And he would always act like he'd never heard the question before, like, like he had to think about it. And he would do this sort of theatrical thing, and they would fall for it every time. And he would say, the next time someone uses a racial slur in front of you, put your hand on his arm or her arm and say, please, not in front of me. And, we all know that racial prejudice and bigotry and hate crimes they're much more complex. They're not solved by that kind of thing, but that is absolutely where it has to start. And I've always believed that. And I love that he said it hundreds of times. And I really love that he acted like he'd never thought about it before, which of course made the person asking the question feel terribly smart. That's quite a gift. Now, the other thing I'll close with here is in one of his last long essays. So this was written, I realized yesterday, more than 50 years ago, which just really threw me. It was for a national magazine, and he was making the point that civil rights are not static things, that we have to keep working for them, which today feels very true. This is the quote. Those of us who are, for want of a better word, co-revolutionists, see now that the road toward absolute equality is longer and more treacherous than we thought. We cannot traverse it with song and enthusiasm. We have to hack our way through prejudice, distortion, ignorance, and plain stubbornness. Hard work and patience are the only blades we have. I think that's a great quote. And I'm grateful that you're all here, mostly all still awake and listening. And I will send you off before the questions with a line he often ended his letters with, which was, "May you live to be 120 like Moses." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for giving us that fascinating introduction to Harry Golden's life, as well as his work and his activism. Kimberly's happy to answer any questions you may have at this point, and we encourage you to post your questions in the chat box or to raise your hand, and we can have you unmute and ask your question. We will start with our first question. Let me see. Andrew asks, regarding Golden's facetious vertical Negro plan to end segregation by removing lunch counter seating, Durham, North Carolina's first Jewish mayor, Mutt Evans, owned a department store in town in the 1950s, which did just that. Is there any evidence of friendliness between the two men that would have fostered the practical application of Golden's idea, or perhaps that the suggestion traveled in the opposite direction?
Golden stole that idea from Evans. That's absolutely right. That's where he got the idea. Evans quietly, who was a remarkable man, quietly desegregated the lunch counter in that way. It's written about in a wonderful book called The Provincials by Eli Evans, which is, I think, actually still in print. So yeah, good knowledge of the situation there. And yes, they did know each other, and Golden was never one to let someone else's good idea go unbranded by his own language. So you're absolutely right on that. Can I jump in, Jen, with a question I just got on my thing here? I'm not sure how these are appearing, but, and I'm doing this because it's from my rabbi, and, you know, I'm not going to not answer his question. Hi, Ellen, wherever you are in the sea of faces, I can't see you. Great way to celebrate this month. Have you ever thought about Golden in the same field of vision as Hannah Arendt and Philip Roth? They were all, I can't quite read that, something the Jewish establishment, oh yeah, bugging the Jewish establishment at the same time. Yes, and it's interesting because Roth was a huge, he and Golden were big enemies. Golden twitted him and needled him as much as possible because Roth once said something in print about him being a lightweight. So throughout their career, there's some great nastiness shared back and forth. But what's interesting about your question is they were, as much as all of them would have been annoyed by being lumped together, they absolutely had the same agenda, and we need all of them. That's the great thing about commentary, is that, you know, you need the intellectuals, you need the great novelists, you need the guy, Harry Golden, who talked to people who didn't all, some of them certainly there was overlap, but a lot of people would never have come across those other writers. And so they were introduced to these important ideas, and the calling, the sort of calling to account these great Jewish organizations. They heard it from Harry, and they wouldn't have heard it from these others. So strange bedfellows, I think, is the tagline on that one. And those are excellent points. And the Roth correspondence, and both Roth and William Buckley Jr. talk about strange bedfellows, were people that Golden was really happy to needle in print and in speeches whenever he could.
Thanks, Kimberly. Our next question is, Golden is in a great American tradition, including Will Rogers and others. Who would you say is the example today?
Oh, I knew somebody was going to ask me that. So there isn't a good counterpart. However, I have here a short list, as Senator McCarthy used to say, here in my briefcase. I have a list of the communists. Andy Borowitz writes for the New Yorker, I think does a lot of this well. A lot of David Sedaris, who I think is hilarious and sneaks in between making fun of his family, a lot of great political observations, a lot of comedians and late night people, Trevor Noah, Margaret Cho, Seth Meyers. I think Kevin Hart, Bill Maher, you know, I don't agree with everything that comes out of all of these mouths, but they make me think. Wanda Sykes, comedian. John Oliver is a really good example of this. Jimmy Fallon. I've been reading a blog called Situation Normal by a guy named Michael Estrin. A lot of stuff there too. So I can't think of any single person who is as broadly exposed as Golden was. You know, who, first of all, I can't think of many who aren't on TV, but I think again, you know, there are some. He did pave the way for these people, and I think a lot of the best political commentary we hear right now is from comedians. Which I don't know what to think about that in terms of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a good thing in terms of it's reaching a lot more people than it might otherwise, but it's a bad thing in terms of, you know, we could use a few more deep thinking people who actually write this stuff down. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag there.
To follow up on that, Kathy asks, to David Brewster's question, which you just answered, do you see a through line from Golden to Jon Stewart?
Yes, absolutely. Jon Stewart, Colbert. Yeah, Stewart's a really interesting example because that's a smart guy who uses satire, but he didn't make his name being, well, he did it first. I was going to say slapstick. He was really kind of, but he found his footing there, and he really he tricked a lot of America into listening to an intellectual conversation. Yeah, I would say, which I think is quite a trick. And somebody, I'm seeing some of these questions too, so I'm probably getting you all out of order here. Someone says, you and Harry are a bit alike, huh? Coincidence, or is it because you grew up reading him? I would like to say for the record, I have only bounced 1 or 2 checks in my life. Not a womanizer. I tell the truth, but I do think my writing style has something owed to Golden. I do think that my sense of enjoying the absurd comes from him. Yes, I think I got only good things from Harry Golden. All the bad things, I learned my lesson by reading him, and I didn't get those.
Our next question is about how Harry Golden actually wrote. Did he dictate like Twain, or personally type or write by hand? Do you know?
Now, there's a question I will genuinely say, I'm not being like Harry here. No one's ever asked that. So he used a typewriter, of course. He had secretaries. One of them was during the war years was my mother. Talk about burying the lead there, but yeah, which my mother always told that story when I was growing up, and I never believed it because she, like Harry, was a good storyteller who made things up. So years after she died, and I was sitting in his archives in University of North Carolina, Charlotte Library, I opened a folder, and there's a pile of notes in the writing of my mother and her name on them. So she actually did work for him, and it was a great moment to find that, although kind of weird after all those years. So Harry dictated. He did type himself. He marked up copy like a newspaper person. It's really great in the archives to be able to see that. I'm a huge archives fan, in case you hadn't picked that up yet. This is a sad thing. As I studied his life and saw his deterioration towards the end of his life, he lost some cognitive oomph towards the end of his life, you could see it in his typing and his marking up of stuff. And that actually broke my heart to see that. But he was of an era where you had secretaries.
Thanks. If others have questions, please go ahead and put them in chat. I'll ask a question that I'm sure you get all the time, but what inspired you to write a book about Harry Golden?
So I went back to undergrad at 40 to Smith College in Massachusetts, which has a wonderful program for mature women whose education was interrupted, because they don't like to say old women who dropped out. And I wrote an honors thesis. The advisor I had is here, actually, Dan Horowitz, a great and prolific historian, as is his wife, Helen Lefkowitz Horowitz. And the two of them made me a better writer, and I needed a way to, a home for that writing. So I wrote this honors thesis on Golden, and then decided to turn it into a book, which I thought would be easy. And of course, wasn't, took a long time. But I think my interest in him was that thing of, here's an unlikely hero. As a newspaper person, I really always liked writing about what I call the off story, which is not the famous person who does something great, but the little guy who almost accidentally brings about some good change. I like the oddballs. I like the flawed individuals. I think, maybe that says more about me than I'd really like to admit, but those are my heroes. And then once I got into learning about Harry's life, there was so much there, and it felt timely. And really, if I hadn't had the support from people like Dan and Helen, and David Brewster and other people who are here, and the University of North Carolina Press, and all these librarians, and my husband, I probably would have bagged it at some point. It was really hard. But once I got into it, I owed so many people for their help and support. And writers, if you make them feel guilty enough, they actually will always finish the job. So I think that's kind of what happened.
We have time for one last question. Has anyone dramatized or wrote a play on him or from his words? And who do you think would play Harry?
So, well, my husband thinks it should be a movie. He's been arguing for that for years, and he thinks we should get Richard Dreyfuss before he gets any older. With a lot of makeup, he could do it. I think Tim's right about that. There was a musical, a play called Only in America that was put out, and Harry was one of the backers and many friends, and it was the biggest dud ever. I think it was terrible. No one, understandably, has ventured forth to do it since. Someone did approach me about a year ago about writing a one-man show about him, which I think I might try to do at some point. I do think it would make a good documentary, or a really good, fictionalized account, because he just was such a colorful character.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. For any questions that folks still have that we didn't get to, we encourage you to reach out to us through our contact information that's been provided, and we'll be happy to address them. We do have a couple of additional announcements before we wrap things up today. First, if you could please give us some feedback about today's program. We hope you've enjoyed everything, and we'd appreciate it if you take a moment to complete a short survey to tell us how we did, how we can improve, and what future programs you would like to see. You can go to the link that you see on screen, or you can click the link that we have posted in chat. Our next program is also in honor of Jewish American Heritage Month, and we'll hope you'll be able to join us next week for another presentation in celebration with Barbara Friedman from the Triangle Jewish Genealogical Society. presenting Tracing Your Jewish Roots in Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. This event will be simultaneously presented virtually and in person, so you can join us on Zoom or come down to the State Library in Raleigh on Tuesday, May 31st at 10 a.m. The registration link for both in-person and virtual attendance is both on screen and in chat. We want to give a big thank you to Kimberly Marlowe Hartnett for a wonderful presentation today. It was, if I haven't said it already, it was fascinating, and it was a great look into Harry Golden's life and work. I've learned a lot. I hope that all of you have learned a lot too. And Kimberly, thank you again so much for joining us. Thanks as well to Mike Milner from the State Library for his chat and text support. And thank you all, everyone, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at future GHL events, and we hope you have a great day. Thanks all.
Thank you.